Greetings everybody around the world. It's time once again for Ancient Aliens Radio. This is the dedicated radio show for the cast of Ancient Aliens. Here we interview authors and researchers as an ongoing investigation into the ancient alien theory. Don't forget to like us on Facebook or subscribe to the YouTube channel Ancient Aliens Radio.
Today we're going to be talking to Nick Redfern, and we're going to be getting into the topic of cryptozoology, something that's very, very interesting. And I've dabbled a little bit of research in. It's a fascinating subject. So let me tell you about Nick Redfern before I bring him on. Nick Redfern works full-time as an author, lecturer and journalist. He writes about a wide range of unsolved mysteries, including Bigfoot, UFOs, the Loch Ness Monster, alien encounters and government conspiracies. He writes for the UFO magazine, Fate and Fortean Times. His previous books include Keep Out, The Real Men in Black, The NASA Conspiracies, Contactees and The Memoirs of a Monster Hunter. He's an extremely popular media guest. Nick has appeared on numerous television shows, including VH1's Legend Hunters, BBC's Out of This World, History Channel's Ancient Aliens, Monster Quest, and America's Book of Secrets and UFO Hunters. He's been on National Geographic channels, The Truth About UFOs and Paranatural, Countdown with Keith Olbermann, and Sci-Fi channels Proof Positive. And Nick can be contacted at nickredfernbooks.blogspot.com. So without further ado, welcome Nick.
Hey James, thanks for having me on.
Sure, yeah, and what a bio you have there, Nick. You've been a busy boy, I think.
Well, yeah, I'm one of these, I guess, who, have a lot of different interests and sort of working full-time as a writer, it kind of gives you the opportunity to sort of dig into a lot of different areas. And my sort of main areas of interest are things like strange creatures like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, as you mentioned, and UFOs. I don't sort of get really involved in too much like ghost hunting, mainly because it didn't really interest me that much, but the other areas do. So I figured, why not do something you like,
Sure. We're going to get into the cryptozoology. I guess, give us a bit about your background. What got you into this? I guess there's something in you, like myself, that seeks out the paranormal, the mystery, stuff like that. That's probably inherent in you. But tell us about your early career, Nick, and how this all developed for you as an author.
Alrighty. Well, it was sort of two things, really, James. One was how I got involved in or interested in paranormal stuff, and then the other one was how I got involved in writing, but they're sort of two connected. But when I was about 6 years old, my mum and dad took me on a week's holiday to Scotland, and of course, you're going to go to Scotland, you've got to visit Loch Ness, and we did. And even though, like as I said, I was only about 6 or I think maybe 7, but probably about 6 at the time, I still got a few sort of vague fragments of memories of my dad telling me this story of the Loch Ness Monster. And of course at that age, sort of 6, it sort of got me fascinated and amazed that, there was a monster in the loch, but at that age as a kid, I sort of, I guess, equated monster with sort of, a monster in the wardrobe or under the bed. It was more like a folklore, ghostly little tale, do you know what I mean? And but as I said, I've still got a few memories of my dad telling me that story, and that's really what got me first interested. And in the years ahead, I guess when the other kids at school were like reading The Secret Seven and The Famous Five, I was reading like Brad Steiger and John Keel, and
Awesome.
Sort of digging. Although I was reading The Secret Seven as well, I think I do remember.
I've indulged in that too myself.
Yeah. So, that sort of got me interested, and this was sort of, when I began to delve into things like Keel and Steiger and some of the early UFOs, this was probably when I was sort of 10, 11, something like that, and began to read more on the subject, as I got into my teens and whatever. Now, when I finished school, I wasn't exactly the best student at school. People have often say to me, which university did you go to you learn journalism? I said, well, I didn't. I actually left school with barely a qualification to my name. I think I had like a couple of barely passed old CSEs. I don't even know if they have them in England anymore now, but and that was it. No college, no university, nothing. And I left school, didn't know what I was going to do. I had no idea. And I just went to go down the job centre one day, and there was a job advertised on a new magazine that was opening in the area that I was living in at the time. It was a newly launched magazine as well called Zero, and it was basically one of these sort of free what's on guides that you can find in most big towns or cities, that have all the local restaurants and bands playing and, what's coming on the local theatre, that sort of thing. And I went along for the interview and amazingly enough got offered the job. And they were just looking for somebody like just out of school, fresh out of school, who they could sort of teach and get on board, to do everything from make the tea to understand the basics of the industry. And I worked on this magazine for about 2 years, and over that time I sort of learned all the background in sort of interviewing techniques, doing writing features and articles, how to structure and format like an article for a magazine, that kind of thing. And it sort of really got me interested in the world of journalism, even though, as I said, I'd had no official training. It was literally just being dumped in at the deep end, which I often think is a good thing, with hindsight looking back. When you sort of like, I was 16, 17, it's a bit daunting, but looking back now, it was a good thing because when you get thrown in at the deep end, you got to learn to swim, which is, what I quickly had to do. So I found I enjoyed doing this because every day was a little bit different. And from there, I began writing for other newspapers and magazines like the Daily Express. I used to do quite a bit of feature writing for them, and local regional newspapers where I live, like the Express and Star, and the Bristol-based Western Daily Press, newspapers like that. And then I thought, after a few years, well, why not try and combine the interest in the paranormal stuff with the journalism, but apply the sort of same techniques, if you like, to investigating and writing about them. So that's what I've done, and I still do a lot of just regular mainstream writing now. That actually probably takes up about 60 or 70% of my time. The book writing, it probably only amounts to like 30. The rest is just sort of, even now, just regular stuff, writing for like music magazines and just regular news outlets.
Kind of like an old school journalistic style approach then, Nick.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've always been of the opinion that just because you're writing about sort of weird stuff, it doesn't mean you shouldn't use regular techniques to investigate it. So, if I was writing about, I don't know, a local murder for a newspaper, you'd go out to the scene, you'd interview the police, you'd interview the eyewitnesses and build a picture. And that's what I do, with whether it's Bigfoot or UFOs. You try and put the picture together and get the witnesses, hopefully get them to speak on record and get corroborative material, and then, you try and build a framework of what happens.
Sure, and I think that stands to you in the book. We're going to talk about your latest book, Nick, The Monster Files. A look inside government secrets and classified documents on bizarre creatures and extraordinary animals. What a title that is, and, the book is packed full of stuff.
Yeah, the subtitle's a bit of a mouthful for
No, but it's very descriptive too, and I love the subtitles. That's what sells the book for me sometimes, Nick, the subtitle, and it's... But, I mean, the book is packed full of information, and we'll get into some of that. But, the point is, there's so much in there I never knew. I've heard some anomalous stories and some mysteries and paranormal, and I got my own areas of, like yourself, that I like to research and get into and stuff, and mystery. But, you've opened up a whole doorway for me in cryptozoology, and it's a big subject, Nick.
Well, it is. I mean, for people who aren't fully aware of what it is, people are wondering what the hell is cryptozoology. It's basically the study of animals that are either unknown or that science and zoology don't recognise as existing, and that would include things like the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, the abominable snowman, the chupacabra, sea serpents, and things like that. Now, we can actually break down cryptozoology itself into different categories. There are creatures that probably science hasn't even recognised or found yet, that might be living deep under the oceans or in the jungles. We just haven't found them. Another category is possibly animals that science tells us have become extinct, but that may not be extinct after all. And this has given rise to, for example, we know that in China and Tibet, up to about a couple 100,000 years ago, there was a large type of ape known as Gigantopithecus, a huge ape. And some people think that could be the abominable snowman. So if it is, that's a creature. It's not so much a monster, but it's an animal that survived extinction. Now, there is like a weirder category, or there are actually two weirder categories. One is so-called out-of-place animals. And for listeners in Britain, everybody, seen one or not, everybody knows these stories about big cats on the loose in Britain. Now,
I lived in Devon and Cornwall, Nick, and that's something. And I'm actually in Antrim now, and there was one on the loose in Antrim. The army had to try and take it out. They were out looking for it here too.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, we get these big cat stories from whether it's England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, wherever, and these stories do fall into cryptozoology because they're basically involved out-of-place animals seen in places where they shouldn't be. Now, the fourth category is probably the most controversial one, but it's the one that interests me most, is where some of these creatures seem to have like paranormal aspects to them rather than just flesh and blood aspects. And that's sort of like a deeper and weirder sort of side aspect of cryptozoology. But in essence, in short terms, cryptozoology is the study and search for unknown animals.
The thing is, Nick, you've been doing cryptozoology for a while. What's different about this new book, Nick? I actually haven't read your other works, but I'm going to get into some of it. You really whet the appetite for me now with this latest one, the Monster Files. But why is this one different, Nick?
Well, I've written about 7 or 8 books on cryptozoology altogether. The earlier ones, there's Monster Diary, there's Something in the Woods, Monsters of Texas, and a few others. Most of those, because when, if I'm doing investigations, I go out onto the road and look for these things. So most of the books, aside from Monster Files, have all been written in sort of like a road trip diary style, sort of like, it was a dark and stormy night and I hit the road, that kind of thing, you know what I mean? So it's like written from a first-person diary perspective. But the new book, Monster Files, is sort of very different because rather than sort of following me on the expeditions, whether it's to Puerto Rico looking for the chupacabra or roaming around Dartmoor looking for a big cat, this one is actually a study of what government agencies around the world know about strange creatures. And the reason why I wrote the book was because over the years I'd get snippets of stories, like, for example, say a British military soldier who said, I was involved in this big cat search and we were told not to talk about it or whatever, that kind of thing. Then I get a few snippets of stories of Bigfoot encounters where the military seem to be involved in those as well. And again, there being like a degree of secrecy applied to the investigation. And so over time, I'd get more and more of these stories, and I was able to sort of flesh them out by tracking down additional witnesses to the point where eventually there was enough material to write a whole full-length book on the entire angle of strange creatures and what government agencies know about them.
It's almost like a real-life X-Files, Nick.
Well, it is really. I mean, the only thing, obviously, it doesn't cover is a lot of the other stuff that was in the X-Files, like ghosts or UFOs. This one pretty much is just strange creatures. But yeah, you're right. They are sort of, because I deal with a lot of official government files in the book that have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, then in that sense, it is kind of like a real X-Files, I guess.
I think that's one thing that appealed to me most. It's not the mystery of the cryptozoology, it's the unknown knowledge that the government's influence on some of these cases.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of like with those of us on the outside of government, they know something's going on, but I don't think they have all the answers, but they're looking for them. And I think some cases kind of mystify them. They're not sure if they're dealing with real flesh and blood unknown animals, or in some cases that might be linked to stuff like the UFO phenomenon, as I point out in a couple of cases. And I think it's this sort of realization that there are disturbing creatures roaming amongst us, and the government doesn't really have a full handle on it. It's things like this, I think, that lead them to sort of classify their findings, and what they've discovered on these various different types of animal.
Okay, let's get into the meat and potatoes here, Nick. Tell us about the story of the US President Theodore Roosevelt and his Bigfoot link.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't necessarily think or even realize that when it comes to things like Bigfoot, that the interest and sort of the chronicling of these accounts actually extends as high as the White House. And President Theodore Roosevelt was someone who had deep passion for hunting and wildlife, and he spent a lot of time in the woods of the United States and elsewhere. He actually travelled the world on sort of safaris and hunting expeditions and things like that. And he was also someone who had an interest in unusual animals and, strange stories. And he was given a story in the late part of the 19th century by a fellow woodsman named Bowman. And he was a guy who spent a lot of time out in the Pacific Northwest woods, which, if like me from England, you think going into somewhere like, I don't know, Epping Forest is big, but you go into the Pacific Northwest woods, you've got forests that extend for literally hundreds and hundreds of square miles. You're talking forests the size of Wales or whatever, and I'm not exaggerating. And so, in other words, because even today, not many people really go into the real depths of those woods. Even if people are going on a picnic, they're sort of just going a mile or so into the woods. You trek sort of 50 miles into heavy forest, you're not going to see anyone, and the landscape really hasn't changed for hundreds of years. Now, Bowman was someone who regularly spent time deep in the woods, and he explained to the president how he'd gone out there with a friend of his, a colleague, a hunter, and they'd come across a little sort of isolated packs of people who literally lived all the time out in the woods. I don't know if they played banjos or anything like that, but that's sort of beside the point. But they were given this story about how there was some sort of strange creature on the loose that had sort of savagely killed a number of people in the area. What was interesting is that it wasn't sort of described as like a mountain lion or a grizzly bear, but from the tracks and the prints of the animal that had been found, it seemed to walk on two legs. Now, there shouldn't be any wild animal in the US that walks exclusively on two legs and that would fit that description in terms of its size and ferocity. Certainly bears can stand on their hind legs, and they will walk on the hind legs, but it's awkward for them to do it. And they certainly don't do it when they're attacking prey. They just charge on four legs at, a high rate of speed. But this creature seemed to walk, run, attack just on two legs. And so this really stood out. And so Bowman and his friend decided to go out looking for whatever this thing was. And they had a brief description, or it's not so much brief, but, the best that the people could come up with as to where they felt this thing was sort of living or living. And so they travelled out to the area, which is heavily dense, isolated forest, and set up a camp and a fire, and spent a couple of nights just, catching animals for food, etc. But they got this sort of eerie feeling that we all get from time to time, when you think someone's watching you and you turn around and somebody 30 feet behind, their eyes are just boring into you, that kind of thing. And they had this unsettling feeling for a couple of days and heard sort of weird, strange howlings and noises in the woods that didn't seem like mountain lions or bears or coyotes or anything like that at all. They had no idea what it was. And so they kept a careful watch on things. And one day, Bowman early one morning, went out to check some of the animal traps to see if they got anything to eat for breakfast, And when he got back to the camp, or as he closed in on him, there was this sort of eerie silence, there's no birds twittering, there's no insects making any noise. And he realised something was wrong. As he got close to the camp, he could see that the tent and everything else was just in disarray and slung about the place. And he called out to his friend, got no reply. That sort of panicked him even more. And as he looked around the camp, he saw his friend's body, and his neck had sort of been twisted and broken in a vicious fashion, and there were deep bite wounds to the neck. And on top of that, it looked like the creature, whatever it was, had sort of repeatedly either stamped on the body or sort of rolled on it, because it was covered in bruises all over the place. And sort of Bowman obviously was petrified and fled the area. But he said that all the way down the mountain back to civilization, which took about 3 days, which that gives you an idea of how far, he had to travel, that by the time he got back, or on the way back, I should say, he got again this distinct feeling of this thing watching him. Wasn't attacking him, but he wondered if maybe he was actually tracking him to make sure that he left its habitat, if you like. Then he vowed never to go back. But he related all this to President Roosevelt, who found it all fascinating and certainly didn't dispute it or deny it. In fact, the exact opposite, because in 1906 Roosevelt wrote a book called The Wilderness Hunter, which was basically like an autobiographical account of all his experiences and people he ran into. And he included the story of Bowman in there. So in other words, we might have been dealing with like an early account of a very savage Bigfoot type attack, which actually reached the eyes and ears of a former US president.
Okay, one thing that's really outstanding for me in terms of research and documentation is the British Royal Navy and the sea serpents. Tell us about that, Nick.
Yeah, well, this is a weird one because I sort of stumbled upon this one by mistake.
Really?
Back in the 1990s, I used to spend a lot of time at the National Archives in London, which was just outside London at Kew. And this is where the British government eventually puts all its declassified files on public display. You can go down there and you could read things like, MI5 files from the Second World War about how they, tracked Nazi agents in Britain and things like that. And, there's just a whole manner of literally millions and millions of pages going back hundreds of years. Like
a playground for you, Nick.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those places, if you're not too careful, you can sort of, spend your life in there, which be kind of tragic and sad, so you've got to try and balance it out, you know what I mean?
For me, it's the British Museum. I go to the British Museum quite regularly. I lose days in there, I do. But...
Oh, yeah, it's easy to do that. But I used to go down there a lot when I was researching my earlier books on UFOs, because I used to write a lot about, government files that the Air Force and the military had declassified, and that's where the files were kept. And it was when I was going through some of the listings of the file names, I came across this one, which was essentially titled Sea Serpents. And it was a 50-year file. It ran from like the 1830s to the 1880s. And it was put together by the old British Admiralty. And it was packed with reports from the captains and the crews of military naval vessels throughout the 19th century. And a lot of the reports were all filed from the area of the Atlantic Ocean, and many of them from around the island of St. Helena in the southern part of the Atlantic. And what was interesting is that most of the reports are not sort of like vague sightings of something in a distance, where it might be considered like a blue whale or something like that. We're talking about sightings where the crews were sort of leaning over the side of the ships and seeing these sea serpents cruise past them at a distance of maybe 100 feet and, part of the body coming out of the water. So in other words, they could see huge amounts of the body at very close quarters. And these official documents actually talk about naval personnel seeing sea serpents in the vicinity of 250 feet long. It's kind of sounds like you expect Godzilla to come along and trash Tokyo or something, you know what I mean? Or, go to war with one of these sea serpents, like one of these Japanese monster movies. But that's literally how they're described, bodies with the sort of thickness of 5 or 6 oil drums at 250 feet to 300 feet long. What's interesting is that even though the reports sort of span half a century, in many cases it sounds like people were reporting sightings of creatures that were all from the same species, because in many cases they were described as having almost like a mane down the head and the neck. Not like a horse's mane, like of hair, but what looked like flaps of skin that made it appear like a mane. Now, what that would have been used for, we don't know. But what we do know, well, yeah, it could be, but some fish actually have little sensors coming out of their bodies that allow them to sense almost like the radar, they can sense when other animals are in their area, like a sonar is probably a better way to describe it. So there might be a connection there, but what I found most fascinating wasn't just the fact that, naval military personnel were reporting sea serpents, but the government was sufficiently concerned and intrigued to open a file on it, and that remained open for more than half a century. And more intriguing as well, the file isn't just full of reports where the Royal Navy had put together sightings from its own personnel, but its staff had actively been scanning newspapers and, snipping little stories here and there. Every time a sea serpent story surfaced, in the newspapers, in the press. So for some reason, which we don't really know why, the Royal Navy had like a secret sea serpent file. Now, admittedly, it's speculation, but I think possibly there may have been concern that, our ships are being sort of regularly encountered by 250-foot-long monsters or creatures. It wouldn't be out of the question that one of these animals might one day turn on the ship.
Oh, they would definitely take if they were real, they would take an interest.
Oh, yeah, and I actually think that the farm might have been opened out of concern that, we need to keep watch on this just in case our ships are ever attacked, and we need to know where these creatures are, where most of the sightings occur, and stay the hell away from them, I think that's probably the approach they were taking. It was not so much they definitively knew what these creatures were, it was just the genuine potential anxiety sort of born out of, well, what if they, a 250-foot-long animal attacks a ship? Bear in mind, we're not talking about huge metal warships like today. We're talking about the equivalent of like 19th century galleons, which a 250-foot-long animal would probably flip over, in a few seconds.
I think that's what the monster foils does. It impacts on you so much because we're tracing this to government sources, Nick. This is the impact that the book has on you. Okay, one of the things that horrified me was the military programs for animals, these humanzees. Now, I had seen something quite recently on I think maybe it could have been Jesse Ventura's conspiracy theory that some government facility was researching humanzees. It might still be going on today, but regardless of that, this Soviet program, the Soviet Union were trying to crossbreed apes and people. It's like a horror story almost, Nick.
Yeah, it is. It's like those dastardly Ruskies, but it's almost like one of those too strange to be true stories, but it actually, the other way around, it's strange, but it is true. And it goes back to the early part of the 20th century, and a Russian scientist named Ilya Ivanov. And he was a brilliant scientist, but he was kind of like a real-life Dr. Frankenstein in the sense that he was fascinated by trying to sort of go into areas, that science and medicine just didn't want to dig into. And that today, with things like cloning and stuff like that, where there are protocols to try and prevent, this sort of stuff from going on, sort of really deep controversial gene splicing and crossbreeding different types of animal. We've all seen these pictures on the internet, where they've sort of taken cells from one animal and insert them into a mouse or whatever, and you create this weird-looking creature. Now, back then, of course, in the early part of the 20th century, there was nothing like, gene splicing and DNA research and things like that was all very much in its infancy, and so the experiments that Ilya Ivanov undertook were sort of pretty basic, but he got official funding from the Soviet government's Academy of Sciences. And the plan that he had, or the thing that obsessed Ivanov, was, was the idea of trying to crossbreed apes and humans. And the two types of creature that he decided to use in his experiments were chimpanzees and gorillas. Now, like chimpanzees and gorillas, we're primates, but our DNA is sufficiently different to make us totally different, to gorillas or chimpanzees. Yeah, we look different, we act different, but we are closely related. For example, our DNA is like 98% compatible, or identical, I should say, with chimpanzees, but it's the small couple of percentages that are different that make us look so different in appearance and the way we act and everything else. But this 90+% compatibility made Ivanov think that, maybe there's a chance of it working. So what he did, as I said, he was heavily funded by the Soviet government's Academy of Sciences to travel to West Africa, where he captured a number of gorillas and chimpanzees, specifically female ones, and had them sort of knocked out, anesthetized, and impregnated with human male sperm. That was, his way of doing it, the most simplest way, but also, really back then, 100 years ago, there was no other known way of doing it. And reportedly, the operations and the experiments didn't work. So he brought some of these gorillas and chimpanzees back to Russia, and tried experiments out there. He had labs built and, extensive scientific equipment brought in and cages for the animals. But again, it reportedly didn't work. And, nature often finds a way of preventing, sort of freaks of nature from being born. And if they are, they very often don't live very long. And so that's the official story. The unofficial story is that against all the odds, some of these experiments did actually work, and that perhaps a few of these sort of freakish human ape crossbreeds were born, but, in all probability they would have been sort of like mentally retarded. They would have, possibly been more prone to disease, genetic afflictions and things like that, and might not have lived long. But one of the stories is that they were banished to the wilds of Siberia, and then ironically, when people saw them, it sort of provoked legends of hairy wild men like Russian Bigfoot, that kind of thing. People not realising, they may have been born out of a lab, so to speak. Now, as I said, we have no proof other than hard rumours that the experiments worked. We know with 100% certainty the experiments went ahead. But what's interesting is that over the years, we do have other rumours of so-called humanzees, as they're known. One was a famous story of a woman named Julia Pastrana, whose photograph I actually reproduce in the book, and she looked unusual. Now, she had a condition called hypertrichosis, which in humans is where it's like a genetic condition where the body and the head and the face everywhere just grows massive amounts of hair at an unstoppable rate. And, 100 years ago, people with that condition, really the only way they earned their livings was sort of in the so-called old freak shows, circus freak shows, because people were frightened of them. But it was just a genuine sort of tragic medical condition. But the person underneath the hair looks absolutely normal, if it's shaved off regularly. But Julia Pastrana, she had hypertrichosis, but equally she had these very large, protruding, powerful jaws, which looked very ape-like, which you can see in the picture, and her nose as well looked very ape-like. And there were a lot of rumours that she was like a half-human, half-ape. And, there's no proof of it, but when you see the picture of her, you have to wonder if, again, against all the odds, this has happened and occurred successfully, occasionally. Although why anyone would want to mate with a gorilla, I have no idea. But
I last week I did a show at Lloyd Poy, and he'd mentioned these Almaty creatures, and funny enough, I find it hard to believe that a Neanderthal could survive that long, and whether it was a Neanderthal or not, I quite favoured a humanzee, and I had never heard that before, Nick. So I quite favour that approach more than anything, to be honest.
Well, it's one of these things where if there are, there could be creatures out there, like not just gorillas and chimpanzees, but like the classic missing link that people talk about, where it could make mating between species even easier, where you wouldn't even need gene splicing. So possibly some of these creatures, these cross, are the result not of humans actually breeding with a known ape, but possibly with an unknown ape that is more human than we realise,
Okay, let's get on to werewolves. The conspiracy of World War II and the werewolf. What's this all about, Nick?
Yeah, well, this actually comes from a friend of mine, a fellow cryptozoologist, John Downs. John lives down in Devon, and he spent all his life, other than a few years in Hong Kong, living in Devon. And he runs the Centre for Fortean Zoology. And Fortean is named after Charles Fort, a guy who basically did what I do now, but about 100 years ago wrote books and investigated strange mysteries. So Fortean zoology is basically strange zoology. And in the early 1980s, John worked as a psychiatric nurse at a place called Starcross Hospital, just outside the city of Exeter. And when he was working there, everybody sort of knew about his interest in things like the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot and so on. And on one occasion, John got talking with one of the elderly retired doctors from the hospital, because they still had like a clubhouse where retired people could come in. And he confided in John that he had a story that he thought John might find interesting. And so John basically sat back and listened, had a pint or two together, and he related this story. And the doctor, during the Second World War, because he was a doctor then, he was sort of, he wasn't, required to go into battle because he had a job, in the emergency services, and obviously with the bombs, dropping on Britain during the war, he was seen, be more important for him to be on the mainland to treat people who've been injured by bomb blasts and things like that. But he wanted to do his bit for the country, so he joined the Home Guard, sort of like the real life Dad's Army, so to speak. And on one occasion, when they were hunting the woods, an area of Devon called Powderham Woods, which is not too far from Exeter, they were actually looking for a German pilot who'd been shot down over the UK, somewhere around Exeter. The plane had gone down, but they hadn't found the pilot. So they figured he'd parachuted and was living in the wild somewhere, hoping to find a way back to Germany. And they were out patrolling the woods late one night, on of all nights, a full moon. And this is why it led to this legend of a werewolf. When they saw this figure, shadowy figure, running through the woods at high speed, one of the groups basically shouted, "Stop!" and the man didn't. And one of them shot him. Didn't kill him, but wounded him, either in the leg or the arm. We're not really too sure. When they raced over there, they expected to see some guy in like a German Second World War fighter pilot's outfit or whatever. But it actually wasn't. It was a completely naked man, but covered in hair from head to foot. And he sort of just grunted and growled, and, with a sort of large chilly moon hovering overhead, it gave rise to, "Oh my God, we've just shot a werewolf." And reportedly, the man was taken to Starcross Hospital. That's because that was the nearest local hospital, and that's where the doctor worked, and subsequently where John Downes worked as well. And John was told by the doctor, who was like in his 80s when John met him in the early 1980s, and he said that all he knew for sure was that the man was treated for his wounds at the hospital, or the creature, however you want to determine it. And then something strange happened. The local police came, there was somebody connected to the military came, and a number of sort of powerful figures in local Devon government turned up as well. And everybody was taken into a room, all the people involved, the ambulance drivers, the Home Guard people, everybody was told, "You won't talk about this at all. This is a matter of security and secrecy, and you'll forget about it." And apparently John Source, he had the fear of God put it into him, and he didn't mention it until he spoke to John, when he felt comfortable doing so, like 40 years afterwards. This is like 1942 to 82 or thereabouts. And so John listened carefully, and the doctor said, "That's about it, I really can't tell you anymore." But John, fortunately, was in a position where part of his job involved cataloguing files from Starcross Hospital, and some of those files went back decades. And John thought, well, I'm going to do a bit of detective work and see if I can get to the bottom of it, see if there are any files on this man or creature, whatever it was. Now, John didn't actually find any files on the man himself, but what he did find is that in the years and decades leading up to when this man was shot, there was a local powerful family which had ties to a lot of high-ranking establishment figures in Devonshire, and what they found was that there was actually like a lineage going through this family of hypertrichosis, because it is actually an inherited condition. This is the one that Julia Pastrana, who I mentioned, had as well, and it's an inherited condition which goes through the genes, and a number of people in this powerful and rich family had this condition, but because back then there was sort of a lot of stigma attached to both sort of mental and physical illness, psychological conditions, etc. And so the people were always treated at home because, the stigma and the shame it would have supposedly brought on the family, that kind of thing. And reportedly, occasionally, these people, although they were treated at home, they occasionally escaped, or they wanted to get out and might have been seen by mistake. Now, sometimes hypertrichosis is also accompanied by like psychological conditions where the person can quickly, has temper tantrums and can quickly turn savage. And John speculated that this may well have been the origin of this hairy man shot in the woods. The location was very close to a large, stately home type place that the family lived in. It was easily within a couple of miles walking distance or running distance. you had the condition running through the family of hypertrichosis, and you had the fact that this was a powerful family who could, take steps to ensure that everybody was told to keep quiet, so it didn't sort of affect the family's reputation. And although John can't prove it, when he's put all these strands together, he's pretty sure that it was, sort of an unfortunate family member with hypertrichosis who, by circumstances and situations, mutated into like a savage full moon werewolf, if you like.
Okay, so we've got cases where they're covering up maybe for that reason, but we've also got cases where when the military might want stories of monsters out, like in the case of the US military and the Philippines in the 50s spreading stories like.
Yeah, that's a really weird story. The book is sort of split into several sections, where I've got files from government agencies talking about monster encounters, but other ones are where, as you rightly point out, where the agencies themselves have created monster stories for their own sort of obscure and strange reasons.
PSYOPs, maybe.
And the one yes, PSYOPs, exactly, psychological warfare operations, which is basically, sort of manipulating or defeating the enemy in ways that don't necessarily involve using guns, bullets, rockets, missiles, whatever. It's sort of affecting and manipulating the mind of the enemy. And the case that you're talking about relates to the Philippines in the early 1950s, when there was an uprising for what were called the Huk rebels, which is HUK, and there was sort of like a rebellious unit that wanted to overthrow the elected government in the Philippines. And the Philippine government approached America and said, can you help us out defeating these rebels? And so, a fairly significant amount of manpower and weaponry was sent over. But what also happened was that a man named Major General Edward Lansdale went out there. And Lansdale, from the 40s through the 60s, was one of the US military's most brilliant PSYOP experts. And, he would come up with sort of a wide range of new and novel and very strange ways of defeating the enemy. And he also became very good friends with a lot of high-ranking military leaders and government people in the Philippines, and they came to trust him and essentially gave him free rein to do what operations he wanted to do. And so what Lansdale did was to look back into the folklore and mythology of the people of the Philippines and see if there was anything in their folklore that particularly frightened the Huk people and which could be used against them. And what he actually found was that the Huks were deathly afraid of like a mythical type creature that supposedly lived in the forests of the Philippines that was known as the Aswang vampire. It's ASWANG. And the Aswang was not sort of like some cloak-wearing Count Dracula type or, something out of True Blood or Twilight or anything like that. It was more just like a savage, monstrous creature that but nevertheless fed on the blood of people. So in that sense, it was like a definitive vampire, but without the cloak and the silly butler outfit or whatever, and so Edward Lansdale decided to try and bring the Aswang vampire to life, not literally, but by exploiting the myth and sort of fabricating the Aswang vampire. And what he did, he actually had like a lot of highly technical people on board, kind of like Q out the James Bond movies, come up with all these different devices and things like that. And literally, and one of them, they came up with this device, which was like a two-pronged tool, which you could hold in your hand, and you could stab a person in the neck, and it would leave like the telltale calling cards of the bite of a vampire. And so what they did, they planned to go out into the woods where one particular Huk rebel unit was stationed. And this was sort of, after the sunset and the forests were in darkness, and they crept up very quietly and stealthily and grabbed the nearest man that they could and pulled him to the ground and then stabbed him in the neck once with this device, which left these two marks on the neck. And when I say marks, they were sort of like huge gaping holes, not little sort of tiny teeth marks, huge holes on the jugular vein, which of course, is a major vein for pumping blood. And so that what they did was to haul the body up, I should say, by the ankles, tie it round a tree branch, and then let as much of the blood as possible drain out of the neck wound. Then after a few hours, they'd let the body down again and then carefully and quietly drag it back as close as possible to the Huck camp. And then when the guys woke up the next morning, the Huck rebels, and found their colleague missing, they go and look for him. They'd find this body, totally white, blood drained from it, sort of massive amounts of blood dried coming from the neck, and these wounds that look like a vampire bite, and they believed fully that he'd been killed by an Aswang vampire during the night. And so they became sort of terrified, and they would flee the area. And of course, that area they were fleeing was strategic land that the Filipino government wanted to get back. So then it was a case of pushing on to the next area, to where Lansdale and his team were able to secure massive amounts of territory back for the Filipino people and the government just by scaring the Hucks out of the area with these vampire tales and these deaths that were real, but they, were ingeniously attributed to the vampire.
Yeah, ingenious is the thing, isn't it? I think the monster links to the military is a necessary need they have then in this PSYOPs thing. I suppose it's different times. About 50 years ago, that might have worked better than maybe today, or depends how it's played out.
Yeah, I think that's why it's interesting. A lot of the cases I talk about in the book where there were PSYOPs involving the military, they did seem to be sort of the 40s and 50s when the Cold War was sort of looming and starting up, and everybody was looking for new and novel ways to defeat the enemy. But yeah, today, people probably just wouldn't fall for it anymore,
Yeah, well, the Flatwoods Monster in 1952, again, we attribute that to the American intelligence again?
Well, yeah, this is one that, even I admit, could go both ways. The Flatwoods Monster story goes back to September 1952, and Flatwoods is a little town in West Virginia, USA. And even today, it's just a small town. The population now is only just in the low 400s, and back in 52, it was in the 300s, so it's not really grown. But what happened was that late on the night of September 1952, a number of people in Flatwoods saw what looked like some sort of object streaking low overhead, and that reportedly came down in a hilly, wooded area just outside of town. So a number of sort of fairly excited people decided, we're going to see what it is. Is it a UFO? And the reason why there was so much interest is because the summer and the late summer through sort of June, July, August, September of 52, there was a massive wave of UFO activity all over the United States. And so this was seen by the village, or the townspeople, I should say, as potentially being related. So a number of them went out there, and lo and behold, they saw what they described as, some sort of lighted object. But all hell broke loose when this sort of 12-foot tall thing came like ambling through the woods. And it looked very strange. It became known as the Flatwoods Monster because, it wasn't sort of like the typical image that people have of aliens today, like the big head and the black eyes and the tiny body. It was like 12 feet tall, had these bright glowing eyes, and it had all these weird electric sparks and flashes and bangs coming off it. It sounds like some cross between the Frankenstein's monster and the Terminator or something. It's like a robotic monster, if you like, or a cross or some, like a cyborg or something like that. Who knows? Not surprisingly, everybody fled for their lives down the hill. And kind of like makes it sound like one of those old Frankenstein films, from the 1930s or whatever, religious with their torches and whatever, And but anyway, they decided to go back up the hill later on, and the thing had gone. Now, since then, Flatwoods and the Flatwoods Monster has become like an integral and staple part of the whole UFO field, where people believe that that there really was some sort of landing by a UFO, but that the creature that came out of it was like a definitively monstrous type alien rather than the typical image we have today. Now, and that could still be the case. I'm not saying that isn't, but what I point out in the book is that when I was doing the research, and the research actually, again, kind of like with the sea serpent thing, I stumbled on this by mistake. When I was doing the research for the chapter on Edward Lansdale, I wanted to try and find out more about the early years of how government agencies were used in psychological warfare and what prompted them to use it. And I came across an old report prepared by the American RAND Corporation for the Air Force. And this was how, it was actually an official document that talked about how RAND was giving the Air Force recommendations on how paranormal phenomena could be used to try and defeat and lower the morale of the enemy. Kind of like with the Aswang vampire, by creating and erecting myths and that kind of thing. One of the things that I found amazing in the document was that it talked about how during the Second World War, British Army troops, or one particular unit, like a scientific and technical unit, had come up with this plan to frighten villagers and townsfolk in little isolated Italian villages. And of course, Italy and Germany were allied during the Second World War. So the idea was try and terrify the Italian villagers and try and have them believe that this creature descended on them as punishment for working with the Germans, so to speak. Now, when you read the file, it talks about how to really make this creature look effective, they built something that was humanoid-like, just like the Flatwoods Monster, that was exactly the same height as the Flatwoods Monster, 12 feet tall. And they wired it up with all these devices that would sort of create bangs and flashes and electrical sparks and like electrical arcs coming from its body and things like that. And they would release it in little towns late at night, just like Flatwoods. And as the plan was to try and scare the Italian villagers to, renounce their ties to the Germans. Now, of course, in 1952, there were no Germans or Italian troops running around Flatwoods or anywhere in the US. But I actually think that because of the deep similarities, the Flatwoods Monster may well have been some sort of psychological warfare tool. Now, of course, the big question is why. And I think there's one possibility that it actually allows for a genuine UFO phenomenon, but also allows for military agencies to actually have exploited the phenomenon as well. For example, we know that leading up to Flatwoods, there really was a massive wave of UFO activity that really did worry the US military. We have the files through the Freedom of Information Act now that show that. And one of the big concerns was how the general public would react in the event of an alien invasion or an alien presence showing itself to us. And this is actually in the official files. So I actually wonder if somebody may have taken a lead from this British operation and said, well, what if we fabricate a UFO landing and we carefully monitor the people who are exposed to it and see how they react? If we can't dictate how the UFOs are really going to act and they haven't landed yet, if we fabricate an event, it will still give us a good indication of how the population might respond. So if that is the case, and they faked the event, and they faked the landing, by having some remotely little piloted device fly overhead, and then have the personnel ready to sort of roll out this weird-looking thing, then that might, and then carefully watch the villagers, they fled down the hill in terror, that would probably give you a good idea as to how the average person would have reacted back then to the, if aliens really did land, it instilled terror. So I think that may have been the reason. It wasn't to sort of maliciously deceive them. It was trying to determine, well, we do have a UFO presence, but we need to know how people react.
Reaction program, Nick.
Like as a guinea pig to see what the response is.
Fascinating. I like that analogy there now, Nick. That's definitely something, because it's sometimes you look at the evidence and you have to go where the evidence takes you, but sometimes you hit you can go either way sometimes. But
and I mean, as I said, what's interesting, and I stress this, is Flatwood's story doesn't deny the existence of a real UFO phenomenon. It actually suggests that the government knew there was one, but they needed to find out how it would respond, so they faked something as well. And I think that's an important thing, that with all these things, like with the Aswang vampire, there are real creatures and there are fabricated ones. But the fact that there are fabricated ones doesn't take away the fact, that there really are strange things out there.
Okay, Nick, we got to talk Bigfoot, because this is my favourite now. If you give me all the cryptozoological animals that's out there, Bigfoot's the number one for me. It's always fascinated me, Bigfoot. And Nessie too, because I've lived in Scotland too. I've actually been in Loch Ness a few times. But
oh, cool.
Big, yeah, and I mean, so that Nessie probably too. And I always think that the only way they're going to find Nessie is if they drain the loch. But
yeah, that would take a long time, I think.
That would take a long time. But on the Bigfoot thing, I mean, just on what you said about the open expanse of the forests, surely the military would train in there. Would they? I mean, I know it's a big area.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends. Again, you've got to be, I guess, in the right place at the right time. And I mean, and if Bigfoot, if they are flesh and blood animals and not something more paranormal, then there may not be that many of them. I mean, we could be looking at a few thousand, possibly all across, where there are heavily forested areas. So you might really have to be in the right place at the right time. But I do have when you mention the military, I do have a couple of chapters in the book talking about how there's been sort of a crossover between the military and Bigfoot. I mean,
they may have
the one angle. Yeah, that's right. There are a number of stories about the military autopsying or capturing Bigfoot bodies, or possibly even living ones. One of the most sort of famous stories, 1980, May 1980, when Mount St. Helens in Washington State exploded. There was this huge volcanic explosion. And what happened was that the mountain itself, it had had volcanic activity for years, but in May 1980, or leading up to it, it started to rumble and smoke was coming out of it. So it was clear, something was going to happen soon. And local authorities warned people to leave the area, and most people did, but more than 60 people were actually killed when it exploded, and there was this sort of massive, sort of plume of smoke that went into the sky, literally thousands of feet into the sky. And it flattened areas for like 200 square miles all around Mount St. Helens. And the blast actually speeds of like 250 miles an hour horizontally across the landscape. That sort of gives you an idea of why so many people were killed. Now, in the immediate aftermath, the emergency services were out there helping injured people, but also injured animals. And, there was reportedly somewhere in the region of about 1,000 elk were killed, and literally, tens of thousands of smaller animals. So, you had animal rescue people out there, but the military also offered a great deal of help, to go out and assist in the recovery and retrieval program. And since, actually just in the months right after Mount St. Helens occurred, and right up to probably about a year or so ago, periodically we've had retired and former US military personnel come forward to talk about their knowledge or personal direct involvement in the recovery of Bigfoot-type bodies from Mount St. Helens. Now, Mount St. Helens itself has a long history of lore and legend of strange creatures on it. For example, there's one part of Mount St. Helens that's known as Ape Canyon, and it's called Ape Canyon because back in 1924 there was reportedly like a violent encounter between tree loggers and hunters out in the woods, with a number of big creatures that would attack their cabins in the middle of the night. Prior to that, the Native Americans who lived in that area centuries ago talked about hairy, giant wild men that lived on Mount St. Helens. So in other words, you do have a long tradition and history of these stories. But the more recent ones that I talk about in the book, because it's relevant, to government involvement, talk about military teams going in with these large double-rotor military helicopters with huge nets hanging below them, and then they would hover over the ground while personnel on the ground were loading these bodies of giant, hairy, ape-like creatures into the nets for transfer to, some presumably like a nearby military base, because, if you're going to fly that across the landscape of the cities, everybody's going to see it. So it has to be one close enough to the mountain. And the stories from there, that they were autopsied and studied and so forth. But of course the big question is, well, even if that went ahead, why would that prompt the government or the military to hide the truth? If Bigfoot's just like a North American equivalent of an African gorilla, why subject it to a cover-up or a conspiracy? It doesn't make sense until you sort of dig into the other aspects, where you find there are a lot of weirder Bigfoot stories where it gets linked to things like UFOs, which that might then necessitates some sort of cover-up because they realise they're digging into sort of really weird territories then.
Sure. I never understood that UFO link with Bigfoot. It's always a bit of a...
Well, it is a weird one. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that, but I mean, I have a chapter in the book on that as well. A friend of mine named Stan Gordon, who's investigated a number of cases in Pennsylvania back in the 70s where there was a huge wave of activity of UFOs and Bigfoot in the same place and the same time frame throughout the state. Stan himself was actually contacted by government officials and asked if he would keep them informed of his findings. It wasn't like some sinister Men in Black threat or anything like that. It was just, hey, you know, we're looking into this. We don't really want to give too much publicity to it, but if you find anything relevant to the UFO Bigfoot link, we'd like to know. And that in itself is sort of amazing that, you know, they would phone and actually visit out of the blue, you know, a Bigfoot researcher and ask for his help. But, you know, that's what happened. And so in that sense, you know, it is a strange thing. I mean, I'll be the first to admit the vast majority of Bigfoot reports are just of, you know, somebody seeing a strange creature in the woods, and that's where it begins and ends. But, you know, there are sort of 6 or 7% of all the reports we have involve sort of people seeing strange lights in the sky at the same time, all these creatures allegedly vanishing in a flash of light, and all sorts of weird stuff like that. So, you know, either we're forced to dismiss all those cases as misidentification or hoaxes, and there's good evidence that many of them aren't, or, you know, Bigfoot isn't just an unknown ape, that there's some other aspect to it as well that we don't potentially at least fully understand.
Okay, let's talk Nessie. We've mentioned good old Nessie a couple of times, the Loch Ness Monster. I kind of favour the idea that it's a plesiosaur, that it's an ancient artefact from God knows how millennia. I don't know if you believe that or think that yourself, Nick. Or... Well,
you know, my view has always been, I try and remain open-minded. I do believe there are creatures in Loch Ness. You know, when people talk about the Loch Ness Monster, it makes it sound like one animal sort of charging around the loch for the last how many hundreds of years, you know, which wouldn't be the case. Like Bigfoot, it's not one thing. There would have to be like a colony of creatures in Loch Ness. And I actually do believe there are strange animals in Loch Ness, but I'm sort of totally open-minded still on the theory as to what they might be, other than the fact that there is something strange there. Now, you know, if a lot of people haven't visited Loch Ness, they don't necessarily sort of appreciate the size of it. It's more than 20 miles long, approximately a mile wide at its widest point, and between about 600 and 700 feet deep. And there are rumours that there are sort of little isolated cave-like areas underneath the loch that possibly take it down to like 1,000 feet or more. And there are also rumours about tunnels and caverns leading out to the Atlantic Ocean and so on. And reports date back centuries. I mean, even before sort of the modern era of tourism and cameras and so on, the people who lived around Loch Ness had a tradition of lake monsters in it then. Back then, the Scottish term for lake monsters was kelpie, or water horse as it translates, and they were described as being sort of fearful creatures that it was bad luck to see and so on. But, you know, today that we would interpret them as like the Loch Ness monsters. And, you know, many people report very similar things, like the large humped back, the long neck, which does sound, you know, very much like a plesiosaur. The only issue, of course, with plesiosaurs, you know, is that on the one hand, they should have become extinct millions of years ago. They're like massive marine reptiles that lived in the oceans. But we know that some fish from that era survived extinction, and sharks were around, as were crocodiles when the dinosaurs were around, but they survived. You know, they didn't become extinct. So, you know, it's possible that, it isn't impossible, I should say, that plesiosaurs could have survived. There are only a couple of downsides to that theory. One is that you know, plesiosaurs were saltwater animals. They lived in the oceans, whereas Loch Ness is freshwater. Now, some fish can adapt. Plus, you know, you have things like saltwater crocodiles and freshwater crocodiles. So that's not impossible. The other thing, though, is that we know that plesiosaurs, which sort of grew to like 20 feet long, were voracious meat-eaters. And for that reason, you know, if you've got a colony of, say, 20 or 25 plesiosaurs living on nothing but fish all day long, you know, they've got bodies that they've got to sustain that are 20 feet long, they would be eating massive amounts of the loch's regular fish population on a daily basis. And that's one of the big questions that's been brought up, whether or not the loch actually has sufficient regular fish, normal fish like salmon, trout, etc., to feed an entire herd of 20-foot-long flesh-eating animals constantly. But, maybe it does. But, other theories are being put forward, like, for example, giant eels. Now, that might not be as exciting as, like, a surviving plesiosaur, but, if you've got sort of a 40-foot eel barreling towards you, that's with a body the size of 2 oil drums, you're probably not going to quibble if that's a monster or not. So it might not be what the Scottish Tourist Board wants to hear, but so I'm open-minded on what the creatures might be, but I am convinced that they're in there.
Nick, you got to tell me about the connection between Lady Diana, the late Lady Diana, Princess of Wales, and the savage big cats that roam the British countryside. Well, and Ireland too, but the British countryside.
Yeah. Well, actually, this comes again back to John Downes, but in a totally different way. John, like me, every day you get sort of a phone call or emails from somebody who wants to relate an intriguing story to you. And this goes back to the late 1980s, and John got a telephone call from a former British Army soldier who had been part of a detachment, like a British Army intelligence detachment, that had been shadowing Princess Diana. And the theory or the rumour was that British intelligence had got that someone was planning to kidnap her or assassinate her. And so this small team, not a huge team, where you've got 20 or 30 squaddies running around the place, nothing like that. It was like just a small team of possibly 5 or 6 heavily armed, well-trained military personnel who could sort of look after themselves, at night, etc., just watching Diana and following her wherever she went. Now, this was this all goes back to sort of the mid to late 1980s, and we know now, partly due to, Diana herself going public before she died, as to how, when her marriage to Prince Charles wasn't doing so well, she saw another number of other people and had brief affairs and things like that. And the British Army detachment reportedly shadowed her pretty much everywhere she went. And the story given to John was that on one occasion when Diana was visiting James Hewitt, who happened to live in Devonshire, and Diana herself, acknowledged the relationship with Hewitt. So that's not in dispute. She acknowledged that herself, not long before she died. And so they essentially shadowed her down to Devonshire because the idea was, they just were not allowed to, let her go where she wanted in the event that she was sort of captured or kidnapped or shot at or whatever. And they were keeping watch apparently on Hewitt's home in Devonshire. And one particular night they were watching through night scopes, and one of the guys was amazed to see through the night scope vision this sort of large black cat prowling around the village right by Hewitt's home. And it was described as not like some sort of overfed fat tabby or anything like that. It's like a 6-foot-long body, 2-foot-long tail with these huge muscular legs and neck, and it gave all the impression of looking like a fully grown black leopard or something like that, or as in generic terms that have become known, black panthers. And everybody kind of froze. They were expecting, in a worst case scenario, if anything ever happened, kidnappers or, assassins or whatever, not a large black cat, and nobody really knew what to do. And the first thought was, well, let's shoot it. Well, the problem with that was that they didn't have silencers on the guns. You start blasting a big cat in darkness in a little sleepy Devonshire village, you're going to wake everybody up. And if that happened, not only would it reveal to Diana that she was being watched and to all the villagers, it would probably, the story about her and Hewitt would come tumbling out, and as would the story about somebody planning to, assassinate Diana. And you can imagine what the son or whoever would have made of all that, And so they quickly realised that their hands were tied. So they did what some people might feel is like a reckless approach. What they actually did was nothing. They just sat there, kind of held their breath, and hoped the cat went on its way across the wilds of Dartmoor. And actually that's what happened, after sort of burrowing around, I guess, for squirrels and hedgehogs or something to eat, whether it found anything or not, it ambled off, just sauntered off in the darkness. It's like 2 a.m. across towards Dartmoor. And so that was the end of the story. But I mean, as I'm sure you know, sort of Devon and Cornwall and Somerset, all round there, they have long-standing stories of big cats on the loose. And what's interesting is that John was given this story, and we can prove from his notes that he was given this story back in the late 1980s. And the whole thing with Diana and Hewitt, that didn't surface until the mid-90s from Diana herself. So that actually adds to the credibility of John's source, knowing about the relationship. And, and the big cat story sort of makes it even weirder. But it demonstrates not just that the British Army has we know that there have been highly publicised hunts for these big cats, like the hunt for the famous Beast of Exmoor in the early 80s. But it demonstrates that in some cases, like this one, even the big cat reports have been subject to great secrecy, not necessarily because of the encounter, but because of the spin-off thing, with Diana. That's what was being hidden, but they had to hide the cat story as well to prevent the rest from tumbling out.
You know what? Well, I've lived in Plymouth and Penzance, but yeah, so that's something I'm quite familiar with. And I hear a lot of people say as an excuse that people used to keep exotic animals like a panther or something like that, and they've just released them into the wild because they couldn't have, when they changed the exotic animals license, that they just couldn't admit to having them. But I don't think that adds up to the number and frequency of these reports, or the number of them.
No, you're right. That's actually a problem. Everybody, or a lot of people, trot out this line about the Dangerous Wild Animals Act and presume it can be proved, which you actually can't. Now, what we do know for sure is that in 1976, the government did pass the Dangerous Wild Animals Act. Before that, anyone could actually own a big cat. But when the law was passed, it cost a lot of money to have a license. You had to prove that the cat was kept in an enclosure it could never escape from, which meant spending a lot of money, on a nice new enclosure, and so forth. A lot of people couldn't afford it. Now, there are a handful of stories, and it is a handful of people who claim to have released, like black leopards and mountain lions and lynxes and things like that. And I actually think some of those stories are true. But if you actually look at the number of people who've actually spoken out and said, this is what I did, it's no more than literally a handful. It's not like hundreds of people. People assume it is, but it isn't. But the problem is, all across, whether it's Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, England, there are hundreds of reports every year. And the sheer scale of reports really isn't reflected by the small number of releases. And on top of that, what makes it really more difficult is the fact that we have reports of big cats, very much like today's, going back to like the 1910s and the 1920s. And there's some indications of like from the 18th and 17th century. So, there's got to be another aspect to this that we're not seeing. So I do think the Dangerous Wild Animal Act has a role to play, but it's a small role. Maybe others were brought from, who knows, overseas centuries ago and bought by pirates, or sailors who brought them back as mascots, and they released them or they escaped. Maybe some of them have been breeding for hundreds of years. We just don't know. But I actually think the answer is going to be in several different realms rather than just one.
Sure. And there's the nocturnal element to some of these creatures too, Nick, isn't there? That they may be nocturnal. Some of these creatures may be nocturnal.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why it often makes finding any animal difficult, It's like most people have seen a fox at night. But you don't often see foxes in day, but foxes are pretty big, but they hide from us easily during the day. Big cats, they have any sort of an innate wariness of people. Even very often, like a tiger won't always attack a person until they go rogue and they become known as man-eaters, but often they'll keep their distance. And so something a bit smaller, like a leopard or, a lynx, would probably be happy sort of hiding out in, like mentioned before, Epping Forest or, forest in Scotland or Cannock Chase in central England, and would have plenty to feed on, whether it was the occasional deer or rabbits, whatever. And most of these types of animals do hunt at night. and bed down during the day. So unless you're looking for them, traipsing through the woods, you're probably not going to see them, other than the occasional time when somebody's driving home like late on a Friday night and from the pub or whatever, and suddenly this cat launches itself across the road. That's usually when they're seen. It's by accident, not when people are actually looking for them.
Yeah, I've got a few Australian listeners to the show, Nick, so I got to ask you about the Australian government's files on the unknown animals. So,
sorry, say that again. You broke up a little bit there.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about the Australian government's files on the unknown animals.
Oh, the Australian ones, yeah. Well, that's an interesting angle because some of their things sort of reflect what we have in the UK. For example, they have reports of large black cats, and again, there should not be anything like that in Australia at all. But people see them, like in Britain, every day of the week, reports come in Australia. But one of the most intriguing files from Australia relates to a creature known as the thylacine, or the Tasmanian tiger, as it's unofficially known. The Tasmanian tiger was a marsupial, like a kangaroo, which means it carried its young in a pouch. But it looked like a cross between an Alsatian, a tiger, because it had all these long stripes all over its back, a coyote, and a wolf. And it also had the very weird ability, and I've reproduced a photograph of this in the book, to almost like dislocate its jaws to allow it to take in prey. Like when you see a snake almost dislocate its jaws to swallow something that's too big to get in its mouth. Well, the thylacine could do that. So you had this very strange canine, tiger-looking animal which could dislocate its jaws. And so it looked very, very strange when you put all those things together. Now, the thylacine reportedly became extinct in the mid-1930s. Officially, there have been no sightings or findings of a thylacine since then. But throughout Australia, particularly throughout the forested areas of Australia and also New Guinea and New Zealand, through the Freedom of Information Act, we now have the Australian government files showing that in all these areas, thylacine reports have been filed regularly by police officers, actually by government people, and members of the general public and police officers since the 30s and right up until the present day. And when you read the reports and the witnesses are talking about like a large dog-like animal with tiger-type stripes, it's pretty clear, and a long tail as well, very long tail, it's pretty clear they're talking about a thylacine. So I won't say fairly convinced, I am convinced that, that these creatures have survived extinction. And nature's good at doing that. We think an animal's gone and then it suddenly pops up again. And so I think one day the existence of the thylacine will be proved, and it was shown not to have become extinct. But it's sort of like a fascinating angle when you find that the Australian government itself has been sort of carefully logging these reports and got some highly credible witness encounters on record.
Nick, have you got any favourite cryptozoology animals yourself? Is any particular story that stands out to you, that grabs you, that fascinates you?
Well, yeah, one that really interests me, because I've been on several expeditions looking for it, is the chupacabra of Puerto Rico, which is described as like this it's described like a hairless chimpanzee-type creature in size, but it has these sort of vicious fangs and claws, and these glowing red eyes. It has like a row of spikes going down its head and neck. It's almost like a mohawk, punk rock hairstyle kind of thing. and it reportedly sort of lives on the blood of smaller animals. And I've been to Puerto Rico on a number of occasions looking for the chupacabra, and again spoken to a lot of highly credible eyewitnesses like civil defense personnel, vets, police officers, members of the public, farmers, all who've had sort of significant input or sort of their own involvement, where farm animals have been killed by these creatures, and farmers in some cases have actually seen the chupacabra, or police officers have been out and, with vets and studied the dead bodies of the blood-drained animals. And so that's one that, sort of really fascinates me, because I've been able to get out there and then appreciate the seriousness with which it's all taken by the locals.
Fascinating. I think sometimes the red eyes on the chupacabra could be because of night vision and as a nocturnal thing, perhaps? Well,
it could be, yeah. A lot of these animals often, they talk about red eye shine. You get that sometimes in Bigfoot reports, and, Bigfoot for the most part is seen at night. So, we could be doing something that's adapted to pretty much almost exclusively, operating at night, other than when it's seen by accident, if you like.
Nick, this publication, the Munster Files, is just out recently. What do you think the outcome's going to be? Do you think it's going to enlighten people? There's going to be more of an interest because of the government links? What do you feel the outcome's going to be?
Well, I hope it'll do several things. One, because, a lot of people, I think, are interested in these things, but still like a ridicule factor that surrounds a lot of it. But I hope that by showing that government agencies take the subject seriously, it's not, as some people think, oh, you only see a cat when somebody leaves the pub after 10 pints. That's not the case. Most witnesses are credible, and the files are highly credible. So I'm hoping it'll add to the overall credibility. And also, I hope it might bring forward people who can add further corroboration to some of the stories in the book. Or, it may bring the occasional soldier forward who said, hey, I know something about this case, or I was involved in this secret search for a big cat or whatever. And, it'll open a few more doors to further stories that give us an even bigger picture of what's going on at an official level regarding these creatures.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a game changer bringing the government files element into all this. Definitely, Nick, definitely.
Yeah, a lot of people just don't realise, the sheer extent and for how long government agencies have looked for these weird creatures.
Nick, tell us your website where we can get your books and any conferences coming up, or you want to plug in any information.
Okay, well, people can reach me several ways. nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com or nickredfern14, Fortean, .blogspot.com, or type me into Facebook and they can reach me there as well.
Awesome. And of course I'll link up your stuff on the capricornradio.com homepage. Nick, it's been a pleasure having you on. Yeah, for sure. And it's been a pleasure having you on the show, Nick. It really has. And I
appreciate you having me on, James. Thank you.
Yeah, well, as I say, we'll talk to you again in the not too distant future, I think, for sure.
All right, sounds good. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Nick.